and a warm welcome to the latest edition of Conversations in Drug Development, brought to you by the team at Boyd's. This podcast is for our fellow community of scientists and clinicians working in the wonderful world of cell and gene therapy and drug development. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome back to Conversations in Drug Development. I'm Chris Moore, and today we are living the dream and diving into the detail of one of the biggest regulatory shifts the UK has seen in 2 decades, the introduction of the new UK Clinical Trial Regulation, or UK CTR for short. I'm delighted to be joined by Shalini Gupta, Senior Manager for Regulatory Affairs at Boyd's. Shalini, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. I'm really pleased to join you today. It's an exciting time for clinical research in the UK, and this new regulation really is a major shift in how we operate.
In today's episode, we will explore the motivations behind the reform, what's changing, and how sponsors can prepare. Lots to get into, so let's get started. Let's begin with some background. Could you give us some historical perspective on the clinical trial regulation environment in the UK?
Certainly, for years, the UK has been operating under the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trials Regulation 2004, which itself came from the old EU Clinical Trials Directive. Even after Brexit, the CTD-derived system still applied, but it wasn't keeping pace with modern research. Following a public consultation in 2023, the UK decided to overhaul the system, aiming for something more flexible, proportionate, and patient-centric.
So this isn't a small update. This is a structural overhaul to modernize a 20-year-old system.
Exactly. The intention is to create a regulatory environment that reflects today's scientific landscape and positions the UK as an attractive destination for clinical research.
So we currently have an old system that is in need of overhaul. Could we review some fundamentals? What exactly is the new UK CTR?
Well, in simple terms, it's a modernized legislative framework that governs how clinical trials are run in the UK. It officially takes effect on 28th of April 2026 and introduces clearer processes, faster timelines, and a stronger focus on innovation and patient experience.
And what would you say are the key goals of the MHRA and the HRA behind these changes?
Well, the major objectives include reinforcing participant safety, improving regulatory efficiency, strengthening transparency, aligning with developments such as EU CTR and ICH guidance update, as well as supporting innovation by reducing unnecessary administrative burden. So overall, the aim is to create a more agile and proportionate regulatory environment.
So this is a big step forward to a more modern and competitive clinical research ecosystem, which sounds great. Let's walk through the biggest challenges one by one, because this is where the industry will really feel the shift.
The changes span almost every aspect of conducting a clinical research.
Well, we will try and cover as much as we can in the time that we have. Let's start small but important. Terminology. What's changing here?
Yes, several terms are being updated. What we used to call amendments are now called modifications, and these come with new categories: Route A, Route B, modifications of an important detail. We have got new acronym, that's MOIDs, and minor modifications. Also, subjects are now referred to participant. Sites will become trial locations.
So even the vocabulary has been modernized to better match current practice.
Exactly. Also, there is a clear guidance on who can be chief investigator, as well as new concepts like notifiable trials. And now we have formally defined non-investigational medicinal products.
Interesting. And we'll cover more of that later on. But first, the approval timelines caught my attention. They are changing a lot, right?
Definitely. Under the new UK CTR, the process is much more structured. First, from the current timelines is the validation period now got a 7-day review window. Then there is a 30-day combined review time. Further, there is now up to 60 days for sponsor to respond to any request for information. And lastly, we now have 10 days for the final review from the MHRA and Ethics Committee.
So if sponsors respond quickly to any RFIs, if they receive them, they can actually get a quicker decision in the maximum 107 days.
Exactly. Speed is very much in sponsors' hand now.
So this is really going to benefit the sponsors that are prepared and have the resources ready to respond to any agency queries received if they get them. It certainly would be benefited some of my clients in the past. What is really interesting for me is the change from amendments to modifications. Can you give us some more insights into the modifications?
There are now several types of modifications. So, starting with substantial modification, we have route A under that and also route B. So, route A is something likely to have an impact on the safety, rights of participants, or reliability of data generated. Route B still is substantial but does not impact safety element, but it must comply to one of the three categories which MHRA has defined, so which are actually eligible for automatic approval within 14 days. Further, we have modifications of important detail. These are administrative oversight purposes, a notification, just submit it, but there is no approval process involved. Further, we have minor modification which can be implemented straight away. They do not need to be submitted to the MHRA or REC, but they must be recorded so they are available during an inspection. Finally, there's a new category called authority requested modification. These are the changes that the MHRA or ethics committee requires the sponsors to make. Often during the review process, sponsors have to complete these within the specified timelines. So there's a whole process involved in that. So I would say each type has different expectations and rules. Understanding which category applies is essential because the wrong classification could delay approvals or even invalidate the submission.
I agree. Understanding the criteria is important for planning what happens downstream after the modification. And that ties into another practical point for sponsors, and they keep asking about this, the validity of authorization. Under the new UK CTR, how long does a CTA actually remain valid once approval is granted?
Yeah, that's an important update. Under the new framework, the clinical trial authorization now has a 2-year validity period from the date of approval. So, if the first participant isn't recruited within these 2 years, the authorization automatically lapses, and the sponsor would either need to request an extension, which adds to administrative burden, or they need to submit a new CTA.
Clearly, another big update in the new regulations is the idea of notifiable trials. Can you explain what that means?
So, the notifiable trials are a new category of low risk clinical trials that meet specific conditions. If a trial qualifies, the MHRA can grant automatic authorization within 14 days instead of conducting a full assessment.
Sounds like could be a major shift for sponsors when applicable.
It is, but only a subset of trials will meet the criteria, I would say. To be eligible, the study must meet at least one of the inclusion criteria and none of the exclusion criteria defined by the MHRA. So, the examples for the eligibility studies include trials using authorized products without modification, established clinical practices, or trial already approved by the recognized regulators like EU or US.
And you also mentioned exclusions for notifiable trials. Are there any we should be aware of?
Yes, so some trials are automatically excluded. Example trials involving minors, pregnant or breastfeeding participants, involving advanced therapy, medicinal products, or if it is first in human study.
So a very defined group of studies that are excluded. That makes it clear for sponsors.
Exactly. Eligible applications are submitted the way as a standard clinical trials for investigational medicinal product, but the cover letter must clearly declare that the application is for a notifiable trial. So if MHRA agrees it qualifies, automatic authorization is issued within 14 days of validation.
But I understand the ethics review will still take up to 30 days for review, right? So what is the practical benefit in practice?
The big benefit is that the MHRA part becomes much faster and more predictable for a notifiable trial. As I said before, MHRA gives automatic authorization within 14 days of validation. With that means one half of the process is significantly quicker, avoids back and forth question, even though the ethics committee follows the same process for all trials.
And sponsors may factor this into their planning then for startup timelines if they have the awareness of notifiable trials. This may impact things like the order of country initiation. Moving on from notifiable trials, the updated regulations now strengthen alignment with ICH GCP updates, especially E6R3. What does this mean for sponsors?
So the MHR is placing strong emphasis on ICH E8R1, ICH E6R3 guidance. Sponsor will need to show their thinking, meaning clear justification of how they are designing the trial or the oversight decision they are making. There are also expanded expectations for oversight of computerized system they're using, laboratory processes, and there's also longer trial master file retention period, and now up to 25 years for new trials.
So operational teams, they're going to have to adjust quite a bit. I think most teams now already have moved to 25 years for the ETMF retention, but extended oversight of computerized systems and lab processes, they could be important. Another shift for operational teams to be aware of, transparency is now a big focus globally. And the UK have also made changes to the transparency requirements within this change. Can you give us some more details on what this entails?
Absolutely. Transparency is a major part of the new regulation, and one of the key changes is mandatory trial registration. So, under the new rules, every clinical trial must be registered in a WHO recognized public registry before the first participant is recruited. So, that's a big shift.
That is. So why is the timing registering before recruitment so important?
So, it ensures full visibility of what research is being conducted. It also helps prevent selective reporting of results. So, trial registration becomes a required right step forward at the very start of every study.
So once the trial begins and eventually ends, what happens next? What does transparency look like at this stage?
So, yeah, there's another requirement in this regard is a timely results disclosure. When a trial ends, the results need to be posted in the same public registry where it was originally registered. So, this keeps the whole process connected and transparent from beginning to end.
Have we been hearing a lot about lay summaries recently? How do these fit into the transparency guidelines?
Lay summaries are now mandatory as well. They are simple, plain language descriptions of the trial results designed to make the findings understandable for participants and the general public. These must be submitted within 12 months of the end of trial.
Right, so that's a big step forward for accessibility for the results for participants, which sounds great. Are there any exceptions or special cases we should be aware of?
Yes, so the phase 1 trials have a built in flexibility mechanism. They automatically get 30-month deferral from full transparency requirements as long as minimum trial details are registered on a public registry within 90 days of the participant recruitment. And the sponsor can request additional deferral for up to 10 years after the trial ends. This helps protect commercial sensitive information for early phase research while it still maintains minimum transparency expectations.
So a real shift in expectations for transparency. This is important to understand and ensure sponsors are aware of these new requirements. In practice, I believe it shifts it so this needs to be planned and implemented earlier in the setup phase. So Shalini, we've already covered a lot, but we still have more to discuss. Another really important area for sponsors is safety reporting. With the new regulations, what changes should people be aware of?
So the safety reporting under the new UK CTR has been simplified and clarified, I would say. SUSARs will still be expected to the MHRA as usual, but the requirement to send every individual SUSAR to investigators and ethics committee has now been removed. That eliminates a lot of duplicate reporting and reduces workload without affecting regulatory oversight. So, just to clarify, the trials which were submitted through combined review still had already this process, but the trial which were non-combined review submissions, they needed to have this separate reporting process. So, this has been now eliminated.
Good. That sounds like a big reduction in admin. What about how events are evaluated?
So the sponsors will now be able to assess the causality of some serious adverse events using the cumulative data rather than reacting to single isolated cases. This leads to more accurate data driven safety evaluation and reduces noise from one off events.
So the focus shifts to trends and patterns instead of reacting to every individual incident.
Exactly. And that's reflected in how the DHR is being strengthened also. There is now a requirement for sponsors to properly evaluate SARs and SAEs within the DHR, whether or not they choose to include line listing. So the report now needs to clearly outline any safety signals, explain what those signals actually mean, and describe any actions the sponsor has taken. For example, things like protocol amendment, extra monitoring, or new risk mitigation measures. And one more bit on the admin side is DSUR no longer need to be sent to the ethics committee.
It sounds to me like the DSUR becomes more meaningful, both for regulators and for sponsors. That sounds like a positive step. Any updates to urgent safety measure reporting requirements? What should we be aware of?
So the timeline for notifying urgent safety measures, specifically those discussed with the medical assessor, has been extended from 3 calendar days to 7 calendar days. So this gives sponsors more time to gather meaningful, clinically relevant data to support the assessment before the submission.
Sounds like the overall goal of this is a more efficient, more insightful safety process, but still with strong oversight.
Exactly. These changes modernize the safety framework, reduce unnecessary burden, and encourage more thoughtful, data driven decision making.
And that's definitely going to impact day to day workflows for safety teams, for sure. Moving on to labeling requirements in the UK, what has changed for sponsors in relation to IMP and non IMP labeling for clinical trials in the UK?
So for IMPs and non-IMPs labeling requirement, they have been updated to align more closely with the EU clinical trials regulation. There are now clear distinctions between authorized and unauthorized product as well as specific rules for hospital only use products.
So that sounds like a helpful alignment. Any particular change that stands out to you?
Yes, one of the key changes that stands out for me is that the labels for blinded trials with the unauthorized IMPs must now include the name of the comparator or placebo alongside the IMP.
Okay, so this means that supply, packaging, and QP teams will need to review and update their labeling and release processes. And that hopefully they will ensure that they are compliant with the new regulations. Good to know. Now, every reform comes with its own challenges. We have recent experience with the EU moving from the CTD to the EU CTR. What do you foresee as some of the challenges the industry may face with this reform in the UK?
So there are few big challenges emerging. So first of all is about the digital system gaps. So at the moment, IRS won't fully support the new process at go live time. So such as the validation of non-compliance or modification of important details, these features are not built in at the moment. So that means sponsor will need some temporary workaround to submit these.
But then to combat this, then are there any plans for a long-term solution, like such as a new online portal for submissions to supersede IRAS, and you use that for submissions and maintenance ongoing?
Yes, the MHRA is planning a new plan and manage health and care research platform, which will ultimately modernize the entire trial lifecycle.
The change from amendments to modifications and the new terminology and processes, this will be a challenge for sponsors to understand. How will this work in practice?
Absolutely. What's important for sponsors to recognize is that the challenge isn't just a new terminology, it is the operational impact behind it. Each modification category now triggers different internal workflows and different timelines. So, organizations really need to have a robust internal decision pathway to make sure the classification is right the first time because mistakes here don't just slow approvals, they can disrupt downstream activities like site activation, trial supply, or vendor alignment. So, as with the previous framework, it remains the sponsor's responsibility to determine the correct modification type. The MHRA has published a decision tree to support classification, which can be quite handy. But I would say ultimately it's just accountability with the sponsor to apply it correctly.
So, when you're doing this for the first time, check out that decision tree on the MHRA website. It's a great tool for sponsors. And then as we're all learning to work through this with this new framework. Any other challenges you want to highlight for sponsors that you think are important to discuss?
Yes, there are a few other important challenges. Transparency is a big one. The new obligation increases expectations for timely disclosure. So the sponsor will need to have a stronger internal process to keep up with. And more broadly, shifting to the new system definition, end-to-end processes will require careful coordination across regulatory, clinical, safety, quality, and digital teams. So preparation and early alignment will be the key.
Okay, thanks for that summary of some of the challenges. That's really helpful. Let's address a big topic for sponsors, the transition arrangements. What do sponsors need to know about this transition period? With the EU CTR we mentioned earlier, the change for all trials to move from the CTD to the CTR. Is that the same in the UK for studies that were submitted via the combined review and the non-combined review? Will the non-combined review studies need to transition over?
So, in contrast to the EU CTR, where all the trials had to move from the old clinical trials directive to the new CTR, the UK is taking a different approach. So, combined review study will naturally move into the new model, but there is no planned transition for non-combined review study either into new part of IRS or new platform at this time. So the key date is 28th of April 2026. Any CTA submitted on or after this date will be treated as new rules clinical trials, and the new UK CTR 2025 requirements will apply. Anything submitted before this date stays under the current 2004 regulations for most areas, even if the decision isn't issued until after 28th of April 2026.
Sounds like timing really matters. So generally, the old rule trials are governed under the current regulations 2004 and not the new UK regulations. What are the key exceptions that we should highlight here?
That's a great question. Yes, there are a couple of important exceptions. While old rules trials generally remain under the 2004 regulations, few areas do shift to the new UK CTR framework. So, first of all, safety reporting will need to move into the new rules for all trials, no matter when the CTA was originally submitted. Sponsors running old rules trial can temporarily stay under the old safety requirements, but only if they notify MHRA within 60 days of 28th of April 2026 or before their next safety report is submitted, whichever comes first. After that, once the first year CUR is submitted following the new UK CTR implementation day, that's 28th of April, all trials will need to transition to fully to the new safety reporting model. So this is really important. And the second one is about the IMP labeling. So that needs to be again transitioned to a new requirement unless the product was manufactured before the CTR implementation date of 28th of April. Further, the new transparency obligation also applies to all trials that were submitted before 28th of April, but they are still ongoing beyond this date. So the only exception to this is a lay summary. These are not needed for these trials. These summaries are encouraged but not mandatory.
Thanks, Shalini. That's a lot of great information on what is changing in the upcoming regulation change. Let's now look ahead. What does the future hold for clinical trials in the UK?
So the future looks positive. The UK CTR is designed to make the UK one of the most attractive places globally to run the clinical research. We will have a clear timeline, a stronger emphasis on proportionate regulation, and more predictable, streamlined approval process. We will also see stronger alignment and collaboration between the MHRA and HRA, which will help create a smoother end to end ecosystem for clinical trials. And lastly, on the horizon, the MHRA is developing, as I mentioned before, is a new platform called Plan and Manage Healthcare Research Platform, which is expected around late 2026 or early 2027. This system will eventually modernize how trials are planned, submitted, managed digitally, which will be a huge step forward.
So overall, a more agile, competitive, and innovation-friendly environment. All of
Exactly.
this sounds very exciting. It sounds like an exciting change to clinical research in the UK. I myself am looking forward to this coming into place and for sponsors to start benefiting from the regulatory improvements. And hopefully, we will see an increase to innovative clinical trials being conducted in the UK because the UK has a lot to offer sponsors, in my opinion, with our expertise across the country. So, to close out the podcast, what are your major take home messages for our listeners?
I would say three things. First of all, the UK CTR modernizes an outdated framework and is a much more efficient, proportionate, innovation friendly approach for running clinical trials. Secondly, sponsors should start preparing now, especially around modifications, transparency requirements, and safety reporting. And lastly, for organizations that plan ahead, these changes will actually create opportunity for smoother startup, faster approval, and more predictable regulatory pathway.
It's a great summary. Shalini, thank you so much for walking us through this. And thanks to our listeners for joining us today. We hope this episode helps you prepare for the upcoming changes and gives you the confidence in navigating the new UK CTR. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow Conversations in Drug Development on your preferred listening platform. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Drug Development, the podcast series brought to you by the team at Boyd's. Don't forget to follow us on the usual podcast platforms or visit our website to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes.